Tonight, I am very excited to welcome Poupeh Missaghi, celebrating the release of Sound Museum. Poupeh Missaghi is a creative writer, scholar, editor, translator, and is currently an assistant professor of literary arts at the University of Denver. She is the author of the novel Transrelating House One and the translator of Nassim Marashi's novel I'll Be Strong for You, published in 2021. Missaghi will be joined in conversation with Christopher Kondrich. Christopher is the author of Valuing and a winner of the National Poetry Series. He is the author of the forthcoming book, Tread Upon. Please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose, Poupeh Missaghi and Christopher Kondrich.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out. Okay, let's see. I'm going to read for a few minutes from the beginning of the book, and then we'll do a Q&A. And then I will tell you afterwards what we're going to do for the second half. I want to start by welcoming you to the Sound Museum. I hope the long flights were not too taxing and that your stay at the hotel has been restful so far. And I hope you're aware of what a unique opportunity we're offering you today. You're a select group of visitors chosen after much scrutiny and the first in the world to receive a tour of our truly exceptional establishment. I want to be conscious of your time and will get directly to the remarks I've prepared to give you some context about our museum before we head into the main wing, and you can experience everything for yourselves. How does that sound? Yeah, good. Wonderful. I'm glad to hear it. So let's begin with the basics. I really value transparency. Unlike many of my colleagues, especially, and I'm sure this won't surprise you, the males. I came to realize during my time as an interrogator and torturer that our government was not doing a good job maintaining an archive of its achievements. I'm proud of our system, mind you, but that pride has nothing to do with the bureaucracy or the day-to-day or the documentation or lack thereof. It's all about the ideology, and even more than that, to be honest, about the spirit of power and control. The thirst for it feeding everything. And who wouldn't feel that way, especially as a woman in a patriarchal system, right? I did my best in my later years as a senior member. I think I need to drink some water. I did my best in my later years as a senior member to shift the gender balance of our workforce, recruiting and training more women. I have many success stories, especially ones about using women for interrogating male prisoners, who are often so full of themselves that they never suspect a woman might be manipulating their male privilege for her own ends, which are, in this case, one and the same with the ends of our system. For example, making them confess to what she needs, giving away some secrets or seemingly trivial information that she can later make good use of. Maybe I'll tell you more about those achievements later, but for now, back to the main point. Unlike many dictatorial and totalitarian regimes, historically and across the globe, ours has not done a satisfactory job of documenting and archiving our interrogation and torture methods. What a loss, really. We've been doing such great work for so many years, and people on both sides of the line would agree with that, those of us within the administration and those upon whom the techniques have been used. I'm sure many would testify to that if needed, or I guess I should say, if allowed. I began to notice at some point that even though most administrators and directors shared the goal of continually honing their techniques to better serve the system, we ended up doing lots of trial and error, repeating our past methods because of this lack of systematic scientific passing on of knowledge among ourselves. So I began taking notes after my own sessions, observing sessions led by the younger team members I supervised, and talking to colleagues during our breaks or our rare shared meals or on outings for covert side projects. Only those colleagues, of course, who didn't mind sharing their knowledge. Yes, bragging was something they all did, but really looking at what they were doing to understand patterns and trends or being willing to share their experiences in order to teach someone else something, no, that didn't happen, at least not from what I saw. I wonder whether that too is in some way related to gender, male superiors not wanting women to know their secrets for success. But then again, I've seen enough of that kind of guardedness within all male groups as well, so I'm not sure. Anyway, I did talk to those who were willing to be more observant and then pass on small bits and pieces of their knowledge. Torture scholar Dariush Rejali, a leading figure in the field, whom I'll refer to often throughout this presentation, along with his book Torture and Democracy, confirms that interrogators do not give away their trade secrets to their rival interrogators. That strikes me as so patriarchal, because for me, from the very beginning, the aim was not just my success or that of any one individual, but rather the success of the collective. Many others say this too, but fail to implement it in reality. One of the key goals of this project is to change that mindset of secrecy. We need to become different human beings with different priorities if we are to succeed and sustain ourselves. We need to work for the good of the whole, for the collective, rather than fall into the trap of Western individualism. In the course of our history, we have learned and continue to learn from our colleagues around the world, though I'm aware that when it comes to torture, each country, era, situation, and even type of prisoner demands its own set of rules and regulations. But still, we all learn from one another. We're in the age of globalization, after all, though I think with regard to torture, we've always been globalized, according to what I've read over years of work on this project. As my interest grew, following my initial observations, I realized we needed to create a museum, a kind of archive, a learning center. And I made it my personal mission to make it happen. I'll tell you later how fucking hard it was to persuade my superiors, all with their fucking male egos, that I, whom they respected for my innovative methods and high success rates, could be the one in charge of this task force. But eventually, I did. A budget was set aside, a small one in the beginning, and they allowed me to work as a one-woman team only, observing and taking notes. After a while, I found within me a growing curiosity to learn about the history of the field and the theories behind what I had practiced and seen others practice for so many years, to be able to critically think about the choices we were making in order to refine them. I think in part it had to do with the desire, integral to this project, to change the widely held stereotype that we, the torturers, interrogators, and prison staff in general, are just the practical hands of greater minds and not necessarily intelligent ourselves. Despite scholarship to the contrary, the public still tends to take us for imbeciles who just follow orders, for dogmatic people who follow our supreme leader with faith as unshakable as that in God. They see no agency in us. We see this to an even higher degree when it comes to our female officers, unfortunately. I've heard people bad-mouthing every woman who wears the black veil or any outfit that's more conservative, believing that all of us are either close-minded or victims, that we got our positions just because of religious or ideological leanings, not because we are educated, sophisticated, skilled human beings who have made choices and are very good at what we do. These kinds of perspectives, which make caricatures of us, are often far from true, and to be honest, they reveal more about the limited viewpoints of those who hold them than they do about us torturers. I want to make a comparison here to clarify things a bit. Think about those who work in banks and financial institutions, especially in your own countries, where banks hold so much evil power over the rest of society. Are you quick to tag everyone who works for these institutions and dreams of climbing the ladder an idiot? Of course not. You can't dismiss the complex role people's individual personalities play in their career choices, or even in their finding themselves in certain positions and deciding to continue on. That's why, in addition to building the museum, we've made sure to document our entire process. The related materials are on display in our archives wing and will later appear in a book, which will also include a transcript of my talk today. So I'll pause here.
Thank you so much, Poupeh, for that reading. So I want to begin with the conceit of Sound Museum and think about and ask you about what it reveals about institutions and power. So a curator, this is the conceit of the book, is delivering introductory remarks to foreign journalists at a preview opening of the Sound Museum in Iran. The museum seeks to exhibit and recreate torture through the practices and conventions of multimedia art. The curator walks us through her thought process behind creating the museum, which she describes at one point as a, quote, living, breathing form of documentation of the government's oppressive cruelties, though the curator hopes the foreign journalists will find the museum both educational and inspirational. So my first question to you is about art as an institution and as an extension of political power. So why a museum as opposed to any other sort of institutional space? Why a museum that felt accurate and compelling to you to explore the themes and ideas of the book? And sort of as a second part to this question, perhaps I can ask you more generally about what you think about the relationship between the arts and humanities as an extension of government and political power. So let's maybe begin with why a museum?
Sure. It just felt relevant because so the character of the book is a retired former interrogator and torturer, and she is very proud of the work that she has done. So the best way to showcase that would be in a museum that would have the pretense of this is like an educational or like arts institute, right? Rather than there is like another agenda behind this. And I was I have also always been fascinated by the idea of archiving and the power within an archive, but also like how archives work with institutions of power. So that was like initially the idea of like, let's have her build a museum. And I thought also a museum would give me like the structure to provide a lot of the research and make this like a meta work. And that's also like why during the speech she gives us a lot of like the work that I did to write the book becomes the work that she presents to her audience. But thinking about the second part of the question, right? Yeah. Art institutions and institutes of power or systems of power behind them. Like we see, like I teach at a university, and in the past year we have seen how the universities that pride themselves as being like sites of freedom of expression, right? And you need to teach your students to do critical thinking, and they need to make connections between the world events and what happens domestically, and all of like these, the rhetoric. And the moment students started to take what they had learned outside the classroom, it became a problem, right? So, or even, I can share a personal anecdote. When I first arrived at my current institution, I was teaching a class on Iranian literature. And that was right at the time when Mahsa Jina Amini was killed and the woman life freedom movement started in Iran. So naturally, the class started to be in conversation with what was happening on the streets. And we were looking at literature and seeing how literature both was predicting what was happening and also was being in conversation, and our readings were changed based on what was happening. So like this two-way direction. And then sometime in the middle of the quarter, I had a parent complain about my course not being a literature course and that it was too political. So I've always been fascinated by like how literature and art is always political, but also a lot of people want to see it as separate. And then within this book, like we see that she is actually using like the language of academia, the language of like art institutions. She's being inspired by artists and like critical thinkers and writers and philosophers to just like push further and further the goals of her agenda, right? And also, again, like in the past year especially, we have been seeing like how art institutions, museums, right, are having a problem standing on the right side of the history, right? While they also like have this like rhetoric of like, oh, DEI, we need to care about everyone, right? But then when it comes to like a political stance, then it becomes like impossible for them.
Well, I'd love to talk a little bit more about the narrator. You know, she sees herself as highly accomplished, right? As a visionary, as an innovator, right? She seems to take a lot of pride in her work, right? And she wants for the museum to sort of, you know, be an extension of that pride, and she wants to imbue the museum with what she feels she has done for her discipline. I believe she calls it her discipline, or actually she refers to it at one point as an industry, which is such an interesting phrase, or an interesting word there. She wants equality, right? But she wants equality in order to oppress, to level cruelty, and to wield the power of the state. Right. So what inspired this narrator?
Okay, so there There's one specific backstory, but another also, like two backstories to that. I think you probably remember there's a, sorry. When a few years ago, the Islamic Republic regime shot down a passenger flight and killed more than 200 civilians. And in the aftermath of that killing, the government also kind of took over and confiscated the funerals of the victims. And in a video that was shared on social media, it was less than like 2 minutes. The video was of a funeral of one of the young women who was killed on that flight. And the regime forces, the guards, they actually so there was the grave, and then they had put around it a scaffolding to stop people from getting close to the gravesite. And the guards were just like standing all around inside this grave, including both male and female officers. And they had kept everyone else outside of that area, including the family members of this woman and people who had come to attend. And the mother of this woman was clinging to the metal bars of this scaffolding and just begging them to let her be by the grave. And then at some point, like one of the female officers started walking toward the mother, and she actually put her hand on the mother's shoulder, and she started to try to calm the mother down. And the mother just exploded, and she just like pushed this officer's hand away, and she started screaming, and she said like, "Don't touch me, and whatever we are experiencing is because of you, so just don't do anything." And I was just like obsessed by that woman who was a guard, part of the system, but in that moment couldn't hold on to this mother's grief, couldn't accept it, or she couldn't just stand there, right? So there was this moment of humanity that she wanted to embrace the mother and calm her down. And I just got obsessed by like, so what's the psyche of this woman, right? She is doing this work of evil every day, but she, of course, sees it as a job, right? And then in that moment, she just like forgets that she is standing on the other side, and she comes forward. So it was kind of like her character that made me think about like, what would it mean to be a woman in that system, but also like be a human being? What would she be thinking about? Yeah. So that's the main story. But then the other side of the story is when Hillary Clinton was running for presidency, a lot of my friends who were feminists were so excited, and they were campaigning for her, and myself included, right? I was like, well, it's important to at some point move beyond like, well, we can only have men as presidents, right? We need to break that gender inequality. But then it's like, well, if we look at the history of what Clinton has done, right? Does it even matter that she's a woman, right? And we see that with Harris's campaign as well, right? There were moments where she was even more eager to show violence or like to speak for violence, because I feel like she needs to prove herself, right? Both as a woman and a woman of color. So there was also like that in the back of my mind, right? It's like, we can't really simplify this across like different identity groups. It's more complicated, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And yet we can't talk about this book without talking about sound. and about silence as well. You write at one point, where would we be without sound? Isn't the language a prisoner utters or withholds within their throat at the core of our sessions? Without the person's voice and the role it plays, whether through presence or absence, our work would lose all meaning. And, I couldn't help but feel this deafening silence throughout this entire book because we are listening to just this narrator for the entirety of the book. But I also couldn't help but think about the ways that pain makes itself present and manifest through sound. In her book, The Body in Pain, Elaine Scarry writes, quote, "Physical pain does not simply resist language, but actively destroys it, bringing about an immediate reversion to a state anterior to language, to the sounds and cries a human being makes before language." So, I found, reading this book, one can get overwhelmed by the sheer amount of sort of aesthetic theory that she is going through, all of the poets and philosophers and, academic speak that gets sort of described, and, she's going through all of this. But what that kind of makes more present is the silence of the foreign journalists. We don't get to hear from them, right? And it also makes us think about what we are not really all that privy to at all, and that is the actual content of the interrogations and torture sessions themselves. So bearing all of that in mind, right, I kind of would love to hear your thoughts about the role of silence in the book, but also maybe think about your decision to not delve into the content of sort of why are these people, we hear about, we can live stream a torture session, this and that, but nothing about the actual contents of the interrogation or session is actually ever described or talked. It's all just talked around. So those are sort of some ideas. I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah. So I would.
And I'm sorry I keep giving you multi-part questions.
No, that's okay. So I would say that the book, so it's all a monologue. It's all one paragraph. We don't have any breaks. And she is the sole speaker without pausing for a second. And she even says oh, hold on to your questions. We will get to your questions after I give my talk. And that was intentionally part of this idea of oh, this is her moment. She is just enjoying the stage, right? And she also is so excited by all the research and the work that they have done that she just wants to share. But to go back to the torture and the interrogation, a lot of scholarship on torture, especially more modern torture, shows that it's not really inducive to any information that's helpful, right? A lot of times, by the time someone is arrested, the interrogators and the officers, they already know what they want. So it's just a performance of power, and it's also a show to terrify others who might be doing similar acts. Let's say if you're a political prisoner, right? So there is no information really that rarely is found through torture that is reliable or helpful. Scholarship shows this. And the other side of this was a lot of material that I read, they discuss that for prisoners, especially if you're in solitary confinement, sound becomes a very important element. You listen for the smallest bit of sound that comes from outside or even from inside the cell. So there was also like that attention that grabbed, kind of like became important for me. But also like thinking about like how at the site of disaster, language breaks down, right? Like we're not able to express ourselves. We're not able to say what we need to say. And then I also wanted, so if you visit any museum or any center that is like a, is made based on documents from like survivors or from like regimes who have done torture, we usually like see objects from prisoners or like instruments that were historically used for torture, or we have videos of interviews, right? And in all of these videos, if you sit down to watch, you're listening for information, right? You're listening for content, right? And especially now, at a time where we are getting so much information about anything happening around us, at some point it's very easy to just like zoom out, right? And for her, I wanted the gesture to be, it's not about the information, but if someone is crying, right, there isn't language involved, but the sound has an affect. And she actually talks about like how she wanted the museum to be about affect, right? For us to experience this as an embodied experience. And I think language could be a barrier against that.
Right, yeah. I mean, it makes it all the more chilling when you think about it, and it makes me think about the performance of the novel itself. I couldn't help but when you began reading the very beginning, right? You sort of reframed this entire space. You repositioned it so that the audience were the foreign journalists, and you are the retired interrogator. But my question then becomes to sort of, you used the word meta before, and I kind of want to come back to that a little bit and think about what then comes about as a result, right? Is this a sort of indictment, right, this novel, right? Because if the foreign journalists aren't allowed to speak, I feel like the reader kind of takes their place in such a way, right? You're being spoken to directly. So is there a sense of indictment that you were going for in terms of, right, towards the reader? Or if not the reader, then did you feel as though this was an indictment of something or someone else?
I guess my intention was to not leave anyone outside of this. Yeah. So in the text, the woman welcomes a select group of foreign journalists. But whenever I read, I say just a select group of visitors, so that you actually think of yourselves as being addressed. So in that sense, yes, right? And I would say, like, when I was writing this, I had a lot of questions about my own desire to write her. So I was also like, I felt I'm also complicit in her voice, in a way. Like, why did I want to write her and not the stories of, like, the prisoners, for example, right? There were several reasons why I was doing this, but it's very hard to sit with the fact that it's like you are becoming this character who you hate, who you don't trust, who you want her not to exist in a way, right? And also, like, by addressing like a group of non-Iranians, right, foreigners, I also wanted to make and kind of like even emphasize the fact that this is not just her story or the story of one country, it's the story of like all different countries around the world. And a lot of the examples that she gives are actually from like the US system, from like Israel, from like different historical time periods. So she just like constantly makes these connections, right? And some, like one of my readers actually said like this, and I'm just stealing that. They said like, it's as if like when you start reading this book, whether like as like listening to it or if you start reading it yourself, is that suddenly like there is no outside of this evilness, right? We are all like pulled into like this hole, right? And that was my hope, right? It was like none of us can actually stand outside and be like, oh, this is not about me, right? I think it's about all of us.
Yeah. And you know, and that is reflected in the form of the novel itself, right? The unbroken paragraph, right? The single solitary unbroken paragraph. Maybe we have time for one more question, and then I could open it up to the audience. Or do you want to go right to, what do you think?
Let's actually do yeah?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. So for the second half, instead of me doing a bit more reading, I actually want to pass on the mic to you all and the book to you all. And I have 2 sections marked, and each of you can read one sentence or two, or you can decide that you don't actually want to read, and we'll just like go around the room and see how this works, okay? So this next section is from one of her research trips, and she was at MoMA, and she saw an exhibition, so she's discussing that exhibition. The exhibition I went to see was about 2 Iraq wars. One, the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq, and the other, the invasion of Iraq by the US following 9/11, which revolutionized modern torture techniques. So you can read a sentence or two, and then from here, and then pass it on to the next person.
One of the installations, in a room of its own, was dedicated to the use of music as an instrument of torture by US forces.
Music. Who would have imagined? Excruciating heavy metal was blasting through the loudspeakers while notes about the use of music by the US military to torture Muslim detainees was projected on the screen. The slides were in alternating colors, red and blue, which always, in that context, reminded me of the colors of the 2 most famous Iranian football clubs, or soccer clubs, as the Americans call them.
The installation was by Tony Coates, an American artist, and it was called Evil Something. I remember 2 particular phrases from the slides. Futility music, which highlighted the futility of the detainee situation, and cultural music, which was used as an incentive for the detainees. Oh, and there was one other quote I remember. Disco isn't dead. It has gone to war.
Which is cheesy, wouldn't you agree? Anyhow, later I had my team do some more research, and they found that the quotes came from an article called Disco Inferno in The Nation by a scholar named Mustafa Bayoumi.
Even for me, just standing in that room for a short while to read all the slides, the music quickly grew quite disturbing.
We have forever? Yeah.
We have forever been warning our people, especially our youth, about the way American culture and entertainment can be used as weapons. We've always known the West, especially the US, especially the US, intentionally uses their culture to attract our youth toward their evil ways of life and away from the virtuous teachings of our prophets and leaders, robbing them of their identity and their innocence.
I don't want to give a lecture on the dangers of what our supreme leader has rightfully called a soft war, a war our smartest minds have been fighting against in full force for many years, a war that, with the expansion of the internet and social media, has unfortunately become more and more complex these days.
The Americans themselves know how harmful and disturbing their cultural products are, so harmful that they can use them even to torture their Muslim detainees in procedures they call torture light. Such arrogance in this phrasing. Besides the content and type of music, what makes the method effective is the sheer volume and duration of the music playing on loop.
That art installation signaled yet another intersection between sound and torture, and it gave me other interesting ideas, not just about our museum, but rather about how we, too, could experiment with implementing music as a new form of torture. I think that's the end of the... Is that the end of it?
Perfect. Do you want to just read the sentence after that and we'll wrap up?
We, too, could begin to use loud music, American music.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you all. So before I say anything about this choice, I'm wondering if anyone wants to say something about reading. No. Silence.
There's only been one other performance. Okay. So this isn't thinking too much about it. I'm just thinking of what you just did in terms of passing around. And a couple years ago, I went to a music performance at a museum, the Knoxville Museum of Art, for a festival. And there was an Irish harpist and field recordist named Ina Dwyer, who set her harp in the middle of the space and instructed everybody. And I think the instructions are important to go up and play a note or two. And I don't know, maybe I was just thinking with you getting us to read out the sentences that talk so much about pulling everybody into it, but also a kind of maybe there's something kind of like a field recording going on. Because I think we think so much about the multi-vocal thing and that being overlaid on the text or whatever, and there being kind of tension with the singular voice and the unbroken paragraph. But I don't know, there's something also about maybe the field recording element of it, or the pulling everybody into a single sort of grounding object, or anyway. So that formally, I think it's interesting what you just had us do.
Yeah, great, thank you. Anyone else wants to jump in? So what I noticed was interesting is several of you, when you start, you just start reading as if you're just reading a text, and then the performative voice kicks in. So it's as if because this is a speech, a talk, you kind of impersonated her, right? And it's interesting because on the one hand, this is what I experienced myself, right? On the one hand, you want to distance yourself from her, but on the other hand, it's you want to give her the voice that she deserves to have, right? And then that is just that. I just I want to say, I just love seeing that tension. But also initially this idea came because the very first time the day I was launching this book in Denver, some weeks ago, for the first time I started reading out loud to practice, and then after a few sentences, I can't do this. I hated it so much, to be able to have her voice in my body and hear her out loud. And then I was well, maybe I shouldn't just read. Maybe I should just go in and have a conversation. But then I was well, people come to listen to a book, right? At least a section of it. So selfishly, then I was well, what if I'm not the only person reading it, right? So other people can also experience her. But it has been very interesting to see people's reaction to actually this. in one of my readings, there were several Iranians in the audience, and it was a bigger group. So like we started like on this side, and then people read, and then we just ran out of time. So we stopped. And then after the Q&A and the conversation ended, like the Iranian friends, like they came forward and they were like, we were all terrified because we didn't want to read. And we were just like worried that the book would come to the side, and what would we do? So it's like just interesting to see like the fact that suddenly you're not just a listener, that you have to actually be the speaker, creates like these resistances, but also like these like intimacies, that different intimacies that you experience with her voice. Yeah. So thank you all for doing it. And some people actually would just pass it on. They didn't want to read.
Yeah, this was such an incredible, unique experience, and I'm just so happy that you brought this book to us and that you stayed with this voice, even though it was clearly, a disturbing one to embody.
Yep, it was.
Yeah, and it's just so interesting, right? There's something so viscerally disturbing about having to read it out loud, as opposed to just sort of reading it to yourself, But thank you so much. This was just so incredible. Thank you, Poupeh.
Thanks.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. And if you all have questions, we still have some time.
Sure. Thank you. Hello. I'm intrigued by the choice of the narrator, and I guess of you, to have the word torture so prominent. Like, she self-identifies as a torturer. It's the museum of torture, et cetera, et cetera. And that struck me as curious because in my limited experience with people who are close to oppressive regimes that conduct torture, they hold fast to these fictions about themselves or the system they're in, et cetera. And I think they would be hard pressed, even if they are like doing those type of activities or endorsing those type of activities, to name it as such. So what was the thought behind that?
You are right? Like, scholarship on torture shows this, actually, like one scholar, Jared Del Rosso, who does research on torture in the US system, he talks about like there are three different types of denial in the face of torture, and one is like just like completely rejecting the fact that any torture is happening, right? The second one is you just name it differently, right? It's enhanced interrogation, for example, right? And the third type is justification, which is, well, we need to do this for national security. We need to do this because they are terrorists, right? So these different types. And in a way, hers is the justification type, right? So she's saying, like, we are proud because this is what everybody does, right? And she's also like in that innovative mode. She's like, well, if we all are doing it, why should we actually hide it, right? So she also advocates for transparency. She says, like, let's just keep our heads high and just say what we're doing. And then in one place in the book, she even says, even if we say we are doing it, who can really stop us? And that's, I think, what we see with a lot of politicians. At some point, they think that they're just like, no one can touch them. So I think like there were several reasons why I wanted her to actually like stand up and be like, this is actually what we're doing and nobody can do anything, right? And also there is another layer that she also brings up in her talk, which is, she says, I know that one day our regime will be gone, right? And I want us to write our own narrative rather than the future generations or the ones coming after us writing the narrative for us. So it's also like a form of control for her. So on the one hand, she's giving up control by sharing, but on the other, she's like, let's write our own story rather than letting others write our story. So she's trying to control the narrative as well. Yeah. Also, like with more modern techniques in interrogation and torture, like the more democratic governments are more and more moving toward psychological torture. And that way they don't have to deny even anything because there are no scars left, right, to deny. Thanks for that question. Yeah, Maria.
So you said it was difficult to embody her voice out loud with these readings, but you had to write it to begin with. And I'm assuming that was difficult. So how did you get through that? And how did you, from what I have read of it and heard today, give her humor, personality? So you did have to live with these words in another way.
Yeah, I know. Well, the humor part, I don't consider myself a person who is good with humor. Like my friends tell me, like, you have no sense for jokes.
I would disagree.
Right. But also, like, I didn't realize this. You also told me, right? But I didn't realize she had humor until, like, people started telling me, like, oh, this is funny, actually, in some moments. So that didn't really help. Like, I wasn't aware of the humor helping me out. This is one of actually the terrifying aspects of the work was while I was writing her, I would also catch myself enjoying writing her because at some point you forget what you are researching. It's just like the research becomes like any other research you're doing. And then it's fascinating, right? It's just like you just like keep going into it and all the new information that you find and like this whole industry, right? They even call it like the art of interrogation. So just like the learning helped me, just like that fascination helped me with the process of writing. But also like more, also, you know this, like I have been in psychoanalysis for many years, and I think if I was not doing that work, I wouldn't be able to stay with the level of violence of the character. A lot of my sessions was like, what does it mean that I'm writing her? What does it mean that I'm embodying her? I don't want to be with her, but I also think this is important. So it was a lot of like self-reflection, and I had the space to do that. And I would also say another layer of distance that was helpful was, so a friend is right now translating this into Persian. And some weeks ago, they sent me a sample because they wanted to make sure that they were getting the voice right. And I read a few sentences and I just closed the document. And then they kept messaging me. I was like, will you take a look at this? I want to continue with this. And it took me several weeks to go back to it. And as I went back to it and I read more, I was feeling so suffocated. And I realized that the English language, which is my second language that I write in, was giving me the distance to actually write her. Like Persian is not my creative language, so I don't write anything in Persian, but just like the very fact that this language has a distance from my, from an important part of my life, I think also allowed me to make her. Yeah.
Any other questions? Not all at once. Okay.
Do you have any final questions? No? Good. Great.
Okay, round of applause then.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.